Yes.
In Switzerland, the law is absolute. You are retired at 65.
I see. So, since then, have you taken on any career moves, or just...
I've been lecturing pretty much all over the place.
Yes.
But no formal regular teaching.
Yes. What do you mainly lecture on?
Oh, an embarrassing range of subjects and passions. There have been, very recently, for example, I went to Milan, to the university, and there I was lecturing mainly to the classics on certain very intriguing moments in Plato and how they have influenced political theory, poetics, and classical scholarship itself. I then went on to Turin, one of my favorite cities, and that was lots of fun. I did a lecture on one line in Dante's Commedia where Neptune, the god of the sea, is sitting on the bottom of the sea, and he looks up and he sees the shadow of the great ship Argo with Jason on it passing overhead. It's a totally magical and fantastic line. And I tried to get those who were working with me and my very large audience, what do you do after Capitaine Cousteau? That is to say, what do you do in a world in which seeing the shadow of a ship pass over your head as you're under the sea is a daily experience for countless snorkel divers, amateurs, deep sea divers, of course, of any kind, and has completely changed the quality of shock. The quality of shock which was surrealistic for Dante, inconceivable that one could ever see that from the bottom of the sea. And then I went through some of the surrealist poetry of Lautréamont, in which there are premonitions of this extraordinary moment. But the point of my lecture was, how do our readings live with the changes in our lives, in our technology, in our habits of consciousness? And then I went on to Genoa, and Genoa has a combined lectureship, the city council, the government, and Genoese business associations, which in Italy are very powerful. And they wanted to know, did I see any real future after Brussels in the hopes for European Union, which are very important for a commercial and harbour city like Genoa. So that was a completely different register of interest. So it very much depends on what my hosts are interested in. My next trips are in October. I'm going to Barcelona. Barcelona has a celebration in its Museum of History. I'm lecturing there, and then I'm presiding over a big international conference which I have planned in Lisbon, in the Gulbenkian Foundation, where our question is, has science reached certain limits, certain frontiers? And there I'm simply chairing and speaking because there are very great scientists coming who are going to debate this.
If I can just pick up two of the points you made there. The first one was Brussels, and after Brussels, and is there any future for Genoa? What was your...
I'm extremely skeptical about any effective future for Europe. The turning point, I think, was, I may have referred to this last time, the total failure of Europe to be able to cope with what was inherently a minor crisis in Kosovo and its desperate pleas to America to come and get it out of the mess.
Yes.
I think that marked the end of many utopian views about European unity. I think there are two tasks left. I'm going to be developing this in Barcelona for today's Europe. Only two effective duties or tasks or hopes. One is to find out how different ethnic groups, cultures, religions can coexist without, in fact, assimilating them. That is the biggest problem. We are not going to assimilate the great Islamic ghettos, which are now running into millions, of course, in France, Germany, and running into large numbers in Britain. The Turkish presence is not going to be assimilated in any classical, traditional sense, but we must try and work out modes of peaceful and indeed collaborative coexistence. And I'm emphasizing this wherever I lecture in Spain because of the great period of Judaic, Islamic, Christian coexistence in early medieval and southern Spain. The second task is the young in Europe have never been as hopeless, hope in a deep sense. Not that they aren't going to make a lot of money, but no sense of an ideology, no sense of any political or utopian future. Never forget that if you don't commit great creative mistakes when you're young, the rest of your life is largely wasted. What were the great mistakes? Marxism, of course, for generations. Fascism also was an enormous mistake, but marshaled, for better or worse, marshaled the disciplined dreams of millions of young people. Zionism in its particular regard. There were many wonderful mistakes you could make in the hope of giving your life to them. And if disillusion came later with maturity, you had at least lived the essential passionate commitment which should be that of the young. There is nothing of the kind today. Nobody is going to die for a hedge fund. Nobody is going to die for the enormous entertainment industries, for the mass media, for the athletic worship, which is all that the young have. So can we again find for the young things worth being wrong about, but wrong about in a creative and passionate way? Those, I think, are the two tasks, and they're very, very difficult.
Do you have any suggestions on the second?
Until there is again an effective left in Europe, we aren't going to get going. That is to say, since 1789 and the French Revolution, hope has always been on the left. Hope is now homeless. Hope is now fully homeless in Europe. We can't go back to any of the traditional left. They've turned out to be not only technically, economically erroneous, but they lead to the gulag in a certain sense. Did this have to be? Or are there modes of radical socialism? Are there modes of the famous third way, which we have simply let go in the enormous wealth of money that has poured over Europe? If we re-enter a period of economic stress, and I think we will, and of the collapse of certain vast luxury structures, there is a chance that a new form of left, in quotes, may evolve. But I wish my own age is such that I'm not really very qualified. I would like to know what the dreams of those young people are who are turning down city careers. They're not numerous. Certain movements command tremendous respect, in my opinion. The French movement, Doctors Without Frontiers, Barefoot Doctors, Médecins Sans Frontières, the various overseas volunteer movements. There are young people passionately committed to helping others in a very new way. If you were to ask me, have there been islands of hope? Yes, of light. I would like to name a few. Like no previous civilization, we're getting worried about ecology. No need to detail that. We know we're on a small, spoiled, ransacked planet, that there isn't much time left. There are a lot of human beings beginning to try and do something, even on a very small scale. Secondly, we are beginning to care for animals as never before. As you and I do this interview, the papers are full of people in flooded parts of Gloucestershire and of Oxfordshire saving animals at any price. We have, and not only pets, the sense that we owe to animals all the possible care, the hate of vivisection, the hate of the abuse of animals and of the cruelty. This is very new. There are tiny signs of it in the late Victorian period, but hardly before then. And the third and biggest is our sense that children are owed protection and care. The sense that the abuse of children, the torture of children, the economic and sexual exploitation of children make a civilization deeply suspect is fairly new. The legal protection of children, the attempt to give poor children a chance of a decent life, these are, in my opinions, the rough elements, the volcanic magma, you might say, of what could become a new humanism.
Very, very interesting. Can we now go back over your writings a little bit? Do you feel which was turned into the death of tragedy. Could you distill the essence?
Yes, this was in a sense, a question had been asked before. Why do great tragedies end roughly after Racine and Goethe in Western literature? Why is tragedy an archaic form? Why is it essentially a great part of the museum of the literary past? This was just before absurdist drama brought forward its own curious parodistic version of the past. You could argue that The Homecoming of Pinter is a fantastically intelligent meditation on Lear. There are many, many meditations on Shakespeare in Beckett in a disguised form. These are not, of course, tragedy in the traditional sense. So I developed a perfectly, I hope, common sense thesis that tragedy is tied to a metaphysics of divine intervention in human affairs, of divine enmity to man, etc., etc., notions which had lost their strength very rapidly after the mid-18th century. And I did not believe at that time, still don't quite believe it, that you can have an agnostic secular tragedy.
And they'd lost their strength because of the scientific revolution and Descartes or what?
Every item of the change in industrial technological life, of urban life, modernity. Modernity is in essence agnostic.
What is modernity?
Certainly modernity is that we've somehow got to make it without anybody either looking after us or coming down to punish us when we get things wrong. Modernity is man's loneliness in a practical world.
So do you subscribe to the Weberian thesis of the disenchantment of the world?
Oh, very much so, the demythologizing. However, what he did not foresee was the development of kitsch mythologies such as those of pop and sport and the modern media. A phenomenon such as Mrs. Rowling's Harry Potter, or The Simpson Family, which is opening in 100,000 cinemas at midnight tomorrow. Great substitute mythologies, infantile mythologies, and this Weber did not really foresee.
And he also didn't foresee the resurgence of fundamentalist religion.
Outside the center of European culture, and, of course, in the United States.
Yes.
There are an estimated 40 million fundamentalists in the southeastern United States and in the Southwest. There are now, this is a figure that keeps haunting me, it came out of a recent survey, there's an estimated 20 million American adults who are quite certain that Elvis Presley has risen from the dead, and to whom the Christ statement, "the King is risen," is a literal truth.
And what is your theory for the resurgence of this kind of fundamentalism?
Oh, surely you yourself, as a social anthropologist, it's what I just mentioned, the terrible solitude. People who are prepared to try and cope with their own very small means are few. The hope, the wish for supernatural agency, intervention, and supervision is constant. The classic text there, a man I otherwise do not really care for very much, Carl Jung, the classic text comes just after the war. The wonderful little text in which Jung says roughly the following: "We have been left in a horrible state, largely destroyed. Very soon, people are going to be seeing flying objects." This is just after 45, and praying and hoping for extraterrestrial investigations of the Earth with a possible view to taking care of us. This comes before the great UFO wave. It completely predicted it and foretold it.
Reminds me a bit of T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, where he talks about the surge of telling fortunes in teacups and haruspication and so on in a time of stress and anxiety.
Well, irrationalism is immensely powerful at the moment. There are 3 times as many registered astrologers in the United States as there are members of the Physics and Chemistry National Associations, 3 times as many. There are people all over London, highly successful billionaire businessmen who build their flats according to fake Oriental mystical arrangements. The wife of our recent and honored Prime Minister, Mr. Blair, wears an amulet against space rays and has consulted various total charlatanisms of New Age persuasion. Oh, a kind of cheap madness is everywhere around us.
You said that Carl Jung wasn't normally your favorite author, but who are your favorite authors and why?
Let me come back for a moment to Jung, because I have a really interesting problem there, or interesting to me. I completely reject psychoanalysis for all manner of reasons, but worship Freud as one of the enduring geniuses, not only of the language, but of cultural criticism, one of the great myth makers with Marx of all time. And I can follow a deep, humane, stern, caustic decency in Freud. I can't in Jung for obvious reasons, for his political behavior, but Freud understood next to nothing about poetic creation. Disgraceful is his famous essay on the poet as daydreamer, which argues that when you grow up you get over this odd thing called poetry. He had virtually no ear for music, and his writings on art, the 2 great essays on Michelangelo's Moses and Leonardo, are among his least adult or persuasive. Jung has a formidable insight into poetic creation. Jung puts what the Greeks called poiesis, P-O-I-E-S-I-S, the process of shaping creation, at the center of the psyche, and knows about symbolism, and knows about allegory, and has a terrific feel for the still mysterious psychic, cerebral, emotional processes of creating a great work of art. So in that respect, anyone concerned with poetic aesthetic creation will be looking to Jung and not to Freud.
Right, and then coming back to authors, it's a huge question, but who do you think has most influenced you, 2 or 3?
I couldn't begin to deal with that. I'm brought up on Homer from about age 5, if not a little earlier. Homer is made daily bread to me by my father. I still regard certain things in Homer as finally unsurpassed. I will give an example because I'm lecturing on that very point in Venice in October. In the last book of the Iliad, book 24, King Priam comes to beg for the body of his slain son Hector from man killing Achilles. I know of no other text in any literature which reaches 1 or 2 of the summits of that text. For instance, a line in which the old man puts his lips on the man-slaughtering hands of Achilles, the hands that have killed his son. But then comes the utter climax. They weep, Achilles weeps for his old father, Peleus, P-E-L-E-U-S, and because Achilles knows he will soon die himself in battle. Priam weeps because he knows his city of Troy will be razed to the ground and burned to ash with all his 50 sons. And in that moment, Achilles quietly turns to Priam and says, now we have to eat, whatever our grief. Neither Shakespeare, nor the Bible, nor Dante has ever, in my opinion, dared that line. And the only one who could have coped with it would have been Tolstoy, who took it from Homer, who is steeped in Homer. Think of that line. The example that Achilles gives very quietly is another mythological figure, Niobe, N-I-O-B-E, whose 10 children were killed in a vengeance by Apollo and Diana, and then the line is very simple, she fell to her food. That's the best translation we have to try and make it very concrete. The there's no cynicism in that line. There is no false modernist objectivity. There's a kind of transcendent understanding of life, of what human life is in the final analysis, which I think no other text quite matches. Or moments in the Odyssey, which I spent my whole life working on and dealing with. I then, of course, turn to Shakespeare, as everyone does, who accompanies my everyday. But in the last analysis, I know why Eliot prefers Dante to Shakespeare. This has nothing to do with comparative merit. That would be idiotic. It is that Dante's philosophic, intellectual grandeur, his passion for the life of the mind, his sense of how ideas work and how ideas become animate forces far transcends that of Shakespeare, who's not concerned with that aspect of life, who does not deal with philosophic doctrine and dogma. There are those who say, thank God, and that makes him the universal. Maybe, but I can't do at any point without Dante, and without the belief that finally the greatest poetry and the greatest intellectual understanding go together.
When you were talking about the depth of understanding of humans in Homer, I was thinking of King Lear on the heath. You know,
But, sorry, I have real trouble with that one. I have trouble, first of all, with the leap off Dover Cliff. At what level of absurdity are we meant to take that? The parody scenes in the hut with the fool are fantastic, surrealistic. They are a kind of metaphysical circus like no one else has achieved. I cannot identify with them. Any point. I can completely with Achilles' Let's Have Dinner. I can completely with the dog Argo, Argo, after waiting 20 years, raises his head when Odysseus comes back to the palace, lets his head be stroked and dies in that moment. He has waited for him. He has recognized him. There are 1,000 points in Homer which invite me to be more human. The Shakespearean case is much more complicated. There's another very curious point, and that's my French education. I plead guilty. You can cut vast chunks of Shakespeare. Everybody does. We haven't seen a complete production of Hamlet in about 30, 40 years, and it was done in this country only because the Russians, with pedagogic completeness, have not cut a single line out of their Hamlet. It's almost 5 hours. You can cut big chunks and it's still transcendently marvelous. Don't try and cut a single line out of Dante or Racine or Homer. I was brought up in a classical aesthetic where totality of willed creation counts enormously. Shakespeare is a script writer. There's never been another on the face of the earth. Today he would write television scripts with delight and with virtuoso genius at every point, recreating the medium as he went along. But they are scripts, not the sonnets, which everybody likes to talk about and nobody reads. Not the sonnets, of course, but the plays are in motion. They are open-ended scripts. They are subject to production, direction, social context, not certain of these other classics, which in my French lycée education were the ideal criterion.
And coming to, of course they are poets too, but coming to slightly more poets, were any of the Romantics influential on you?
I hold the heretical conviction that Keats's letters are incomparable. They're Shakespearean. If we had the letters of a young Shakespeare, they'd be like Keats, much more than the poetry, which I think is often lush and almost embarrassingly adolescent for all its greatness. Shelley, you have to do in selected bits. I don't buy Lewis's all-out condemnation, but I know why he made it. Coleridge, I'm enveloped in, but it's also the Coleridge of philosophy, metaphysics, theology, political theory, science. And in late life, But this is the experience of many people. This is a cliche. Wordsworth has come to mean more and more to me. Things I had difficulties, great difficulties with, the prelude, the excursion, mean more and more to me. I think Wordsworth, in his epic structure, is a poet for the aged.
Ironic, since he thought he was writing about childhood. I was brought up in Hawkshead.
So you know his country.
Very well, yes. To go back to your own writing, what was your next book after The Death of
Well,
Tragedy?
I'd already been working on the book on Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, and that hammered out an immature, intuitive, unripe persuasion that very, very great literature depended on the possibility of the question of God being important. Not on believing in, but that the question, is there a God, had to be somewhere centrally serious and relevant to the great art, and that the way the Russian novel towers over all other prose fiction, why no other literature has a War and Peace, an Anna Karenina, a Brothers Karamazov, a Crime and Punishment, an Idioms, is the ubiquity of the God question in Russian literature. And I tried to develop this, and the perfectly, I suppose, routine feeling, ask a person which of the two he prefers, Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, and you have a shorthand portrait of that person. That's been said before. It meant not altogether seriously, but as a kind of very serious game.
And what about more recent writers? Are there any of the 20th century?
Oh yes, I couldn't do without Beckett, of course, at any point. He is to me the transition to what lies ahead, the unknown that lies ahead. Oh, and Musil, M-U-S-I-L,
yeah.
Musil and Proust accompany me at every point. I distrust most Joyceans. Now, they have read select bits. I have worked my way through Ulysses with endless admiration and with fun and being very moved, but Finnegan's Wake is bluff, in my opinion, as are those who claim to have read it. They have not. They've all read Anna Livia Plurabella, we all have.
How do you spell her? Plurabella?
No, sorry, she's one of the most famous figures in literature.
Yes.
Don't make me angry. Anna
Okay, right.
Livia, Livia, Plurabella, Plurabella. She's the one who sings on the Liffey in Finnegan's Wake.
Yep.
Anna Livia Plurabella of the rivers flowing. Everybody, he himself recorded that passage. It is stunning. Ask people whether they've looked at anything else in that farrago, and I think they will finally honestly admit, of course you can't read it. As I was for, 26 years, the senior literary critic on the New Yorker, modern fiction poured across my desk. I knew that Nabokov was Nabokov from the word go. You can't read a sentence of Nabokov, even of his useful short stories, without knowing you're in the hands of a master. Of one. Oh, constantly, yes.
What about Yeats? Do you have...
Yes. Yeats, the great poems are like no others. There is too much, and there is a great deal that is purple, and there is a great deal that is lush and self-indulgent. But the great Yeats is incomparable.
Good. He's my favourite 20th century poet. Coming back to poetic creation, you said that, I mean, it's a mystery, but do you have any views about the sources and springs of poetic creation?
My sadness is that I haven't had certain printing errors which commit you to immortality. Thomas Nash, N-A-S-H, sometimes with an E at the end, but scholars disagree on this, contemporary of Shakespeare, rival of Shakespeare, very envious of Shakespeare, translates Villon. Not translates in our sense, but adapts the famous ballads of Villon. There's one on the ladies of the past, where are they now? He translates beautifully a French line about Helen of Troy. And as she goes grey, brightness falls from her hair. Very beautiful line. His printer misreads the manuscript and gives us a brightness falls from the air. One of the great lines of world poetry, by which Nash is remembered and honored. And I've never had a printer nudging me into immortality. The luck of that era, that too can be great creation. The factors are probably too complex for any analysis. What it is that fires the synapse in the cortex into finding a metaphor of this, I keep worrying about, not worrying is the wrong word. I keep trying to read about it and to learn from those qualified to help me. Plato, who says everything, Plato, and I mean that, had we only Plato, we'd be all right. Plato says a metaphor is two areas of the brain brought into unexpected contact. There it is. He knew nothing about synapses, electric arcs. He was intuiting that in the metaphor, somehow unrelated centers of cortical activity are brought into collision and contact. It may be so. We cannot produce it by electrodes. We cannot find, to put it childishly, that area in the cortex, which is, we have language areas, smell areas. We're beginning to know a lot about music reception. There is no poetry area. There's no explanation of how children have produced very great verse, or the very young. Mystery is a too easy a word. It's a saving enigma. It's a saving riddle. What I would say is this, is that probably, great poetry, Shakespeare above all, results when you hear around a word all overtones and undertones. When, without having to look it up, without having to make it deliberate, something in you takes in a field of association, so that around the word you're using or hearing, as a musician may hear the overtones and undertones which he does not explicitly need to note in his score. Shakespeare seems to hear about, around every word, the totality of possible linguistic usages. What makes that possible? We know next to nothing. Will brain chemistry teach us more? It would be stupid of me not to think so. The progress being made in the study of cerebral lesions and functions is so rapid and dramatic, but I hope it won't be very definitive. I hope that this will remain enigmatic.
Do you know the study of, I think it's called The Road to Kubla Khan? Xanadu, yes.
By Livingston Lowes,
yes.
L-O-W-E-S.
Yes.
Yes. He was a Harvard professor. He was very immense presence, so dead already, in all our lives there. What he does is to trace Coleridge, what Coleridge called the hooked atoms of association.
Right. Galton's idea, yes.
Here, and how everything Coleridge read, heard about, hooked into a chain of rich association. But this remains completely at the surface, and Livingston Lowes would not have wanted to be mistaken for a depth psychologist. He probably despised depth psychology or did not believe in it. It doesn't take us very far. It's wonderful to know what books Coleridge read and where the distant chain of imagery, names, association, and sounds begins. It doesn't tell you why everybody else could read the same books and nothing would happen. This is the puzzle. Correlative experiences in different human beings, and in one human being the synapse fires. Look, in the primary school in Bern, the teacher on a school expedition, taking the little ones, the really little ones, to look at an aqueduct. They trotted out to look at an aqueduct. There's a beautiful Roman one near Bern. And she said to them, do your best to draw it, and handed out colored pencils and paper. And one child put shoes on the pillars of the aqueduct. And every aqueduct has been walking since. He was called Paul Klee. And luckily the teacher knew in that moment what she was looking at. No human being had ever put shoes on the pillars of an aqueduct. And now we know aqueducts are in motion, are indeed legs with shoes on. How does that happen in a 6-year-old? We have no clue. Hurrah for not having a clue.
Have you yourself written much poetry?
To my embarrassment, yes, because in French education, you wrote verse. It was part of the discipline. You even wrote on the baccalaureate a little Latin verse. God help us. And you wrote verse almost, to put it embarrassingly, this was the attainment of a gentleman, as you, in Edwardian and Georgian England, so many wrote amateur verse. Then at Oxford, I published verse with a whole number of very distinguished other people in a little series of Oxford poems. And one day, one morning, I woke up with the full understanding that verse is the contrary of poetry. It isn't a lesser form. It's the absolute denial of poetry, and I've never been that stupid again. But yes, I did. I also started by drawing and painting a great deal, and I mentioned that last time. This may have been a mistake to stop.
And what about music? Are there...
No. The point being that in my time, music meant learning the piano, and my handicap made that impossible. So I was spared that humiliation. But of course, music is constant and indispensable. And I do love the Groucho. It is Groucho or Harpo Marx, one of the two. What instrument do you play? Lo-fi, middle-fi, and hi-fi. And that's entirely my case.
And which musicians? Which composers are your companions?
Sorry, from Guillaume de Machaut to John Cage and the present. There are great musicians at the moment. Nothing in music which doesn't seem to me worth learning about. Now, again, this is a mark of age. I find myself turning to Haydn and to Haydn's chamber music more often than to some of the giants who I was concerned with earlier. There is in Haydn a gift of peace, a gift of calm forgiveness, a gift of acceptance, which I find almost nowhere else.
And Handel?
No, I'm not a Handelian. He is the rich man's Elgar. This is a very British conviction. I know how important he is. I find much of it, particularly the operas, monotonous to a degree.
Often you started off with your family background and the relationship to God, and you've mentioned him a number of times as central, at least asking the question about God. Do you ask this question? I
won't go into this. You will find it, so far as I can put it into language, in the book I'm publishing in January.
Oh, right. Can we know the title of the book you're publishing?
Yes, I'll gladly tell you about it. It's called My Unwritten Books. It's 7 chapters on 7 books I have not written and why. It may be no good, but it's totally original. No one has ever tried to do this. No one has ever tried to do this. Why did I not write 7 books, which I very much wanted to write, hoped to write, should have written, and I try to explain the inhibition in each case.
Can you just give us a sample of one?
Oh yes, with pleasure. For instance, one is on my confession that there are those of us who love animals better than human beings, who can be moved more deeply by the suffering of animals than by that of human beings. And it is the history of my life with our 4 Old English sheepdogs. I really did want to write that book. But to write well about animals needs tremendous luck and gift. It's something very few writers have ever quite achieved. Then there is one on the question you have just raised, the last chapter. What are my political and religious positions at the moment? Because I've so often been challenged, why don't you come openly, why don't you declare your politics? So I tried to in that chapter. One chapter is called Zion. Several times in my life there was the obvious chance to go to Jerusalem, to move to Israel. And my father was a member of the original Zionist Association in Vienna when he was a young man, so it goes back a long way. And I try to explain my failure of that. There are different aspects. One is the only time I've written erotica in my life. It is a chapter no one else, I believe, would have dared try, making love in different languages. It's an immense problem, central, the Don Juanism of language. No one has ever tried to do it. What is it which makes making love in one language so different from doing it in another? Where do the parasympathetic nerve systems of sex and language meet, and how do they influence each other? So each chapter is a book that I should have but did not write, and I try to explain.
Delightful. What a lovely idea. Well, I think we've probably taxed you enough, but are there things I should have asked you? What would you have asked yourself that I haven't asked you?
The most vulnerable of all, which you have been too kind to ask, and which is one of the chapters in this book, called Invidia, the Latin word for envy, to spend your whole life among the alpha starred, to have them in the office next to you in the Institute in Princeton, to have them here at the high table, to meet them at literary occasions, to hear them lecture, even to have had them in this house, the ones who change our lives, who create things, to have had Borges taking his afternoon nap in my wife's study, to have had for a time Crick and Watson as colleagues, to have not met with, but met with, close to Derek Walcott when Omeros was published, one of the greatest of modern poetic works, and to know that one's own skills as commentator, teacher, explainer, a propagandist for quality, critic, are eternally doomed to being beta double plus. To know this clearly, to know it when you get up in the morning, to know exactly where the light years of difference lie, and that there can be no bluff. To know that in every field, the distance between Tiger Woods and the excellent runner-up, not today where Tiger has done badly, but almost any other time, you know what I mean, to play Federer at Wimbledon, the hopelessness of it, the strange hopelessness that nothing can leap that barrier. Now, certain literary criticism, by force of language, moves into the field of creation, usually by great creators, by Eliot, by Coleridge. It's entirely conceivable. The task of the teacher is the one I love most deeply, honor most deeply. We talked of this last time. It is an immensely important task of transmission. The privilege of carrying the mail, as I always put it. That wonderful film Il Postino, where Neruda is shown in exile and the local mailman and his relation. Neruda gives him his poems to put in the mailbox. I'm incredibly lucky and privileged to have been the mailman. And a number of times I've helped work to break through. When I published the first essay, I think in English, on the greatest German poet since Rilke, Paul Celan, C-E-L-A-N, the TLS very kindly asked me, how do you spell it? Because the name had never been heard. He's now 1,000 doctoral theses a month, etc. To have helped the real thing reach people, break through. My God, how lucky I am. But it will never, never fool me as to the essential second-ratedness of one's job as an academic, as a commentator, which is happy to be a happy parasite. If one could somehow imagine a man who could do this would be Edward Lear. He could draw a happy parasite, but that's how I think of it.
Well, I was wondering, to distinguish, is this the Salieri complex? I mean, basically, you know as Salieri that Mozart is...
Yes, if you want, but it's much older than that, it's eternal. What was it? You'll read all about that if you care to look into my little book. What was it to have lunch next to Dante? It's part of the human condition. The alpha are very, very few, and they are different from us. Very Jejune remark of Fitzgerald, the rich are different from us, and Hemingway's stupid answer, they have more money than we do, which is really as silly as you can get. That's on a very minor. The creating those who are electric with the step into the unknown are different from us. Often it is luck. Linus Pauling, whom I have met, was 2 weeks away from the DNA breakthrough, as we know, having already 2 Nobels before then. Think of that. 2 weeks away. When Wallace and Darwin.
Yeah.
So many cases, not probably in the arts, where nobody else can be Schumann or Schubert or Chopin. There is one, and though around him there are many sustaining forces, without any doubt. The sociology, even of the greatest artist, is complex. It is contextual in part. But in one night, fed up with his bullying father, in one night, Kafka sits up all night, being a notorious insomniac, and writes his first great, great story, The Judgment, which contains just about the whole of modern literature, in one night. And that's what it's all about. And if I can get people to be as excited as I am about it, to read it with me, to try and understand it, if I can get the people around my table, as I did in Geneva in our seminar, to learn by heart some of the poetry I love supremely, I've been incredibly lucky, incredibly lucky.
We probably should end there, but I'm intrigued. Is it the job? In other words, is it literary criticism, which means that you can never be alpha? Do you know Yeats's poem, The Scholars, where
yes.
Bald heads scratching?
And I know Yeats's Monuments of Unaging Intellect, and I know much. Yeats's own prose, forgive me, is embarrassing. I mentioned already Eliot and Coleridge, of course many more, who step into literature with their criticism, but they're usually great poets, so that it is an ancillary act.
Do you know any literary critic who you would say was right up there?
No, because the business of criticism is itself secondary in essence. There are very great critics who played a major role in the history of culture, of thought, of education. Matthew Arnold, a Leavis, a Trilling, and my predecessor on the New Yorker, Edmund Wilson, who shaped taste. But it is a secondary. If Edmund Wilson had not written about Joyce, Hemingway, and helped launch Great Gatsby, somebody else would have. It is a distributive function, not an autonomously singular function.
But I think you don't need consolation, but your work has changed people's lives.
Well, I'm very grateful, and as I say, that's why I kept saying I'm lucky, but it's not the same thing. Please bear in mind, Nash, a brightness falls from the air, and no one else can have that. It's incredibly unfair. It's incredible. Why has God, or the devil, I prefer to think of it as the devil, been so terribly clubby and unjust in his distribution of great creative gifts? But they have. And at 6 years old, one is Paul Klee, or one isn't. And reflect on that example of the walking aqueduct. Reflect on the complexity or divine simplicity of a child's discovery. And you can't fake that. That's the wonderful thing. You can't bluff real creation. Endless people try to make it as if it were like, no, it isn't. It may take time to be fully recognized. It may, oh God, be destroyed by political horror, by illness, by... I don't believe in mute, inglorious Miltons, but they may exist, of course. And we simply, by definition, would know nothing about it. But Sainte-Beuve, the great French literary critic, Sainte-Beuve, B-E-U-V-E, Sainte-Beuve said, in his bitter jealousy, in his devouring jealousy of Balzac and Stendhal, they will never build statues to critics. He was probably wrong. We live now in a parasitic culture where the critical, the commentary far exceeds the work. Endless people, this drives me to distraction, buy biographies of great writers, artists, and never read a word writer they're reading about. And let's close on a polemic note.
Yes.
There were many reasons why the Faculty of English of Cambridge University decided they did not wish me around. One of them was that while I was still lecturing, they put on the tripos for commentary, a passage from Eliot's famous essay on Dante, to students who had never read a line of Dante. And I made no secret of my view of the treason of the clerics, to use the famous phrase, of what this involved. That one doesn't do. One doesn't set criticism of Dante to those who've never read a word of the Commedia.
Let's end on that note.